Thank you for that. And I think everyone needs to sit down quietly and think about Avril's very comprehensive discussion. And I will try and link with that a little bit. As Avril said, I think many of us in patient advocacy wear several different hats. Avril was mainly speaking on behalf of Retina International, which is interesting because I represent two patient groups, LHON Society in the UK and Ouvre les Yeux in France, where I live. Both actually are not members of Retina International, but having said that, we collaborate very, very closely with Avril and her colleagues in that organization. And we support each other in a whole host of different ways. This is all about collaboration. I'm going to try and speak fairly quickly to keep to time. I hope I'll speak clearly, but by all means, I'm more than happy for the slides to be made available later for people to refer back to, which may help. In addition to two patient organizations, I am, as Patrick mentioned, very closely involved with ERNI, which I'll discuss in a few slides' time. I spend a lot of time as well as with the European Medicines Agency. By the way, I see that it mentioned employer on my bio. I'm not actually employed by anyone. Everything that I do as a volunteer. The European Medicines Agency, I serve in several capacities. I'm a member of what they call the PCWP, which is their Patient and Consumers Working Party, and the main body by which the EMA actually liaises with the patient community, both for advice and input into their policies, but also to disseminate information to the patient community. And then with Eurodis, I also volunteer in a host of different capacities. Eurodis, as Avril said, is an umbrella group with, I think, something like more than 1,000 patient organizations that are members of Eurodis. And those patient organizations are from 74 different countries. Bearing in mind some of those patient organizations will represent tens of thousands of members, then it's actually a very powerful voice. And they are very closely involved and always consulted by the European Commission when looking at rare disease policy. The UN says there are 44 nations in Europe. There are 27 members of the European Union. And there are other countries that, as I say, Eurodis is representing 74 different countries. But within the European space, the EU is far and away the dominant force. And the European Medicines Agency is the primary regulatory regime for the region. Even those countries that are not part of the European Union will generally take their lead from the European Medicines Agency. As most of you will already know, prior to 2015, there was no approved treatment for LHON. And so, generally speaking, this was treatment options were restricted to dietary, lifestyle advice, and low vision support. But in 2015, Raxone was awarded exceptional approval by EMA and immediately authorized as a result for the then 28 member states of the European Union. Great. However, regulatory approval doesn't mean that patients have access to medicine. Every country has its own rules and regulations to decide which treatments are going to be made available or at least will be reimbursed in those countries under their national health systems. And so, in fact, you don't get a level playing field. There are in 27 member states in the European Union, there are something like 60 different agencies that are undertaking this work. If I speak a little bit about the UK, where I have been mostly involved, Raxone was approved by EMA, as I say, in 2015. In fact, it was a couple of years later, in 2017, that it was approved by the Scottish Medicines Consortium. And our society was very closely involved in the consultations that led to that decision. We were also very closely involved in the decision by NHS England, covering England, to actually we made strong representations and recommendations for it to be approved in England, but at that time it was denied approval. And to this day, Raxone is still not available in the English market. It's important to know that while the UK is regarded as a single country, there is considerable autonomy, especially in health matters, between the different countries that compose the UK. The same also applies in several other countries in Europe. So in Italy and Spain, there are regional differences. As a result, in England at least, a lot of patients resort to self-medication, purchasing generic idebenone, generally from the USA, where you can easily obtain it over the counter as a health supplement. And it might be worth noting as well that in the US market, idebenone or Raxone is not approved by the FDA. And so the only option for patients in that territory, and indeed most of the rest of the world, is to purchase generic idebenone over the counter. Patients in England are desperate for treatment. And one of the things we have been strongly arguing for is a level playing field, because if it's available in Wales, the disease is the same in England, and patients are absolutely entitled to have access to that. There is one of the problems is cost, of course. Medicines are expensive. Health systems are under pressure everywhere. But there are also huge costs in not supporting patients. And I've mentioned here a couple of things that Avril was very closely involved in. There have been a couple of surveys that Retina International sponsored that have actually, and the links are there, that it can be followed up. And these surveys have actually tried to calculate the total cost to society of vision loss. This is not just what it costs to the health system, because in some ways that's an artificial measurement. Many patients, when they realize there is little that they can achieve by continuing to visit their doctors, just stop going. But that doesn't mean that the cost to society ceases to exist. The support that they require, the other losses in taxation and other problems mean that this is actually a huge cost and something that needs to be much more carefully considered. Elsewhere in Europe, in Germany was the leading country for accessing, is generally leading for accessing of rare disease treatments. And typically, when the European Medicines Agency approves a treatment in Germany, then it is made available in the market there within a few months' time, almost automatically. A little bit more complicated than that, but it's a very quick decision. In France, it's fairly similar, and the treatment was approved in France just a few months after Germany. However, it was put under review in France in 2020 as a 5-year measure to investigate whether the cost effectiveness to the French health system. So there was some disruption to patients at that time, but that has now been resolved, and patients have full access to Raxone in France also. But it's a pretty unequal situation. There is good access in some countries, there is no access in others. I think Raxone is now available in something like 20 countries in Europe. That's not all in the European Union, of course. And so that means if we've got 44 countries in Europe, we're something like half the countries in Europe don't have access to any treatment. But Raxone isn't all we're looking for, of course. Most people regard Raxone as a stepping stone, and we need more. Future trends, we've got a number of therapies under development, including the information that was provided by Neurop earlier on, and I think most people here will be aware of Gensight in Europe, who have completed a number of trials for Lumevoq, but for the moment, that is still pending approval. In fact, it needs to be reapplied. The company has released press information to confirm that they will be doing additional trials, and the likelihood is that they will be making reapplications in the not too distant future. But I think I would say here as well that we really need to have far more basic research. Some of the facets of the gene therapy trials, some other research on idebenone and other pharmacological products have really shown us that there is so much that we don't know about this disease still. And speaking with a number of people, a number of clinicians and researchers, I think there is a wide recognition that we need to go back to basics, and we need a great deal more basic understanding of the mechanism of disease, what triggers the disease, and even actually the epidemiology of LHON, which a number of recent studies are suggesting that what we had always thought to be the natural history of the disease and the prevalence of the disease perhaps needs to be questioned and revised. Europe is a really diverse region. We have different legal regimes, we have different cultures, different languages, different geographies, and so we have a number of different organizations, mostly operating on a national basis. It would be great to think that we could get together and have a Europe-wide common voice for LHON, and I think that would make us more powerful within EMA and within the European Commission when it comes to policies. Thankfully, we do have people like Retina International, and I'll speak about ERNI in a moment, that are also advocating on our behalf. But this is just a selection of some of the patient organizations that you can find in Europe. And as I say, you can have a copy of this later. In Europe, at least, patient engagement and patient involvement is perhaps a little different from most other regions in the world. And something like, 7 years ago, really, as a result of a lot of pressure from Eurodis, and I have to say, a fairly sympathetic approach in the European Commission, we had something called European reference networks that were created. There are 24 different reference networks covering all, and Avril mentioned 6,000 to 8,000. Some even say there are 10,000 rare diseases in Europe. So it's a huge number of diseases, but these have been aggregated into 24 separate ERNs. The relevant ERN for LHON is ERNI, which has its base in Strasbourg. And there are something like 60 university hospital centers in 25 EU countries as members, with, I guess, 300 to 400 experts regularly involved in those meetings. The ERNI represents all rare eye diseases, something like 950 in number. And I'm involved as a patient member of this organization. We have, I think, 8 patient members. As you can imagine, 8 patients trying to represent 900 plus different diseases is somewhat challenging. And we all have to try and remember that we are there not just, in my case, I'm not just representing LHON, but I'm representing a whole host of other rare eye diseases. But in fact, we are much stronger together. And if we try and do things as our little organizations, we will find it very difficult. We move much faster and much more powerfully by collaborating together. The ERNs, we collaborate very closely with the clinicians and researchers there, and we are involved as full partners in that organization. The networks, I could spend several hours talking about ERNI. Essentially, they are involved in sponsoring and encouraging collaborative research, both between the members and other organizations elsewhere. ERNI is absolutely committed to maintaining relationships all across the world. And at our meetings, generally speaking, we have people invited as guests from North America, from other parts of the world to join in our discussions and our work. We are also involved in preparing and producing educational materials that can be used anywhere in the world, subject to translation and other difficulties, of course. And we have something that is almost unique, I think, which is the virtual clinics that the network actually mounts. That allows experts from several different countries to meet together online. And we have a clinical patient management system that was developed at great cost by the European Commission for ERNs that actually facilitates those meetings. So that when our clinicians get together to discuss a particularly unusual or difficult case, then all of the medical data can be shared securely and comprehensively between those clinicians, including high-resolution scans and other data. Okay, sorry, it didn't seem to want to advance. One of the projects that we have on our table at the moment is a clinical consensus statement for LHON, which is something that was delivered, I think, 6 or 7 years ago by a group of experts in a consensus statement. But that's a document that really is in need of updating, given all of the developments that have taken place in the knowledge of LHON and, of course, in potential treatment for LHON. So what we want to provide is a set of guidelines for clinicians, for regulators, a document that is actually available and accessible for multiple stakeholders to allow them to have a full and comprehensive understanding of the state-of-the-art knowledge and the likely future developments of treatment and research in LHON. This has been a major European Commission project. They invested a great deal and have put together a toolkit and a process that we are following within the ERNI that allows us to have a consensus statement that will be fully validated and acceptable to regulatory authorities, as well as clinicians, patients, anyone else that has a need to know and understand. I think I've got another slide here. Yeah. So in order to deliver this, we plan to convene an international panel of experts, including LHON patients, not just clinicians and researchers, but people who have a lived experience of the disease will be involved. And this is to be a service to the whole community. So people in China, people in Australia, anywhere in the world, they will be able to reference this. There are, of course, national nuances, but that will be made clear what is transferable and what isn't. This will be involving experts from around the world. It isn't a European project just for delivery and for use in Europe. And in order to have a consensus statement that will be acceptable around the world, then experts from around the world need to be involved in that work. The funding and administration of it can be provided by ERNI. So another important thing is a lot of these documents in the past tend to have been sponsored by industry. The problem with that is that particularly when it comes to regulators or reimbursement authorities, they take one look and they say, well, yes, this is biased because it was paid for by the company that might benefit from the advice that's being given. The fact that this will not be suspected of having that bias is a very powerful indicator, and we would also seek to have some support and validation from regulators. It's possible, this is a major project, it's likely to take a year in delivery, and it's possible for experts to be invited at a later stage. We will be using a Delphi system for achieving the consensus, and so there will be no European bias. The project is to deliver something that will be fully unbiased. And then finally, if I just quickly talk about, I've talked a little bit about the desire to have European collaboration, but LHON isn't a European disease, of course. And so we want to have collaboration with patient groups elsewhere in the world. We're already closely involved in discussions with patient groups in the US, Canada, and Australia. We have an obligation to support patients wherever they are. In the UK LHON Society, because English is a fairly universal language, we have members from India, from China, from Vietnam, from anywhere in the world where they can use English as a means of communication. And we're absolutely keen, together with Eurodis, to help in establishing more patient groups in China, in India, in all of these territories, so that patients themselves can benefit from this type of collaboration. And with that, I will hand back. Thank you.